So yeah, thank you very much, Professor Pierluigi Sacco, for joining us here. As I mentioned in the welcoming remarks session, Professor Pierluigi Sacco is a professor of economic policy at the University of Chiete-Pescara. He is interim director of the IP10 Policy Optimizer at the EIT Culture and Creativity Institution. He's senior advisor to the OECD, and he's also research affiliate at the Meta Lab at Harvard and ISBC CNR Naples. So thank you very much, Professor Sacco, for accepting our invitation to give this keynote speech. It's really an honor for us to have you here, and we are very much looking forward to learn about all that you have to share during this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria. So, as I understand, I have roughly half an hour to develop this argument, right?
That's correct. Yeah, exactly.
Very. So today I would like to share with you some thoughts about what is the current state of the art and the future prospect of the European cultural creative industry. Is a topic of incredible importance, and the fact that Europe has just launched a new kick, culture and creativity, of course, testifies to the importance, political and strategic importance that Europe is starting to give, finally, to the culture and creative sectors. However, we are also in a very, very complex period in which the scenario is quite changing and quickly. So what I would like to share with you is some considerations about how this scenario is actually shaping up and what are the main challenges ahead, and especially what could be the future opportunities for Europe. Because the cultural and creative sector, as it is shaping up today, is an extremely difficult arena. And from this point of view, Europe is always best to address the complex challenges that we are facing. So first of all, the first element that we have to introduce is the post-pandemic scenario. It's very important to understand that there has been a real watershed in terms of how the pandemic crisis has changed the mode of access and also of content delivery in the cultural and creative industries. So it's very important to consider that, for example, some industries that were relatively thriving before the pandemic crisis, like, for example, cinema, have faced now a completely new challenge because, for example, even if there has been a relatively short break with respect to the traditional modes of access, today people are getting increasingly accustomed not to consider the physical cinema theaters anymore as the reference point for reference, let's say, mode of access, for example. This was already changing, has been changing for a while, but the trend from this point of view has, for example, accelerated dramatically in the case of cinema. In the case, for example, of music, we have, of course, a real new uptake, for example, of live concerts, but at the same time, it's also very, very, very important to consider that, for example, the music streaming industry is changing dramatically again. The modes of access to musical content and in some sense is creating a new possibility for online streaming that, for example, was not a real option before, unless, I mean, we consider some extreme experimentation like concerts in Minecraft on digital platforms. But today is clearly becoming the case that, for example, live music concerts on digital platforms are becoming a real option for the future. These are just a couple of examples of a broader tendency, that is the idea that cultural contents today are finding modes of dissemination access that are increasingly different from the ones to which the 20th century culture and creative industry has so much. So from this point of view, it's very important to understand who is actually driving the innovation in this context and how Europe is positioning in this regard. So this is something that we will explore in some more detail in a moment. But before saying this, I would like to focus on what is the even broader context that is perhaps the most important to understand what we are discussing. The evolving geography, global geography on culture and creative production. We have been accustomed to think of a global scenario in which the West was basically the almost exclusive provider of content. Throughout the cultural industry of the 20th century, it was basically the US, or more generally North America and Western Europe, that was basically the real powerhouse of culture and creative content. And most of the rest of the world was basically either a provider of, let's say, very local content with limited diffusion, or with, let's say, basically as big as leadership in content provision. For example, if we consider the book Martel's team, it was published in 2011, where Martel surveyed extensively the culture in in some detail the new content platforms created in the Middle East, in the Gulf countries, for example, or in Asia, like Bollywood. But he concluded that basically, I mean, these were really local markets, however impressive and dynamic, and the future mainstream was basically, again, Western and especially American. Well, this prediction has not aged well. We have seen that just in 10 years, this change, and they have changed, showing that more interesting and many forces outside of the West. It's true that, for example, the predominance of the Hollywood industry and, of course, the wave of digital giants is still predominating in purely quantitative terms. But in terms of capacity of innovation, and in terms to reach global audiences, especially young global audiences, this situation is changing. We have examples of emerging content powerhouses outside the West that are really changing the model radically. And from this point of view, one of the most impressive examples is probably South Korea. So it's interesting to consider South Korea as a pilot case, because what we are hoping there is, in many respects, what is probably going to become the future paradigm for the emergence of new content powerhouses outside the West. So if you look at South Korea, it really looks like an unlikely candidate for a global powerhouse. First of all, it's a relatively small country in demographic terms, under 50 million people. It's, by the way, a country that adds no particular global visibility in terms of for example, their own specific content. I mean, 10 years ago, probably no Western audience would be able to identify any distinctive trait of Korean culture and creative production. Today, things are very different, as we know, but it's important to understand why. And at the same time, the language spoken in Korea, that is, of course, Korean, is a language that is really not widespread and used outside of Korea. So clearly, that would constitute an almost unsurmountable obstacle to the diffusion, for example, of Korean content. Despite this, Korea, as we know, has become a global cultural sensation. So the question is why? First of all, it's important to understand that in the case of Korea, the expansion of their popularity in terms of content has not scaled immediately from local to global. First of all, it's been a first level of scaling in the macro region. Of course, Japan, China, and the Asian Southeast. And the reason is particularly interesting The reason why Korea has been so dynamic in this regard is that it has built on a very, very innovative model of content creation that is in some sense very much representative of what we are gonna see in the future. Let's explain this in a moment. The first element is what we could call a post-copyright business model. As we know, Europe is almost obsessed with this idea of defending intellectual property to serve the profitability of the culture and creative industry, and of course to protect the interest of cultural professionals and creators. Although the intention is very good, in practice, the consequences of this could be much less intuitive and not necessarily favorable. Let's understand this with the Korean example. So, in the case of Korean content, as we said, I mean, there was no particular reason why we should pay to this content in the first place. But one of the reasons why it really spread so quickly, initially in the East Asian context and now globally, is the fact that most of this Korean content was freely available. For example, let's consider one of the most successful products of Korean cultural industry, TV series. So from the very beginning, when they were aired in the Korean TV channels, immediately after, these TV series were available for free download practically everywhere on digital content platforms, and at the same time, this download was accompanied by the availability of subtitles in English and increasingly different languages that were initially carried out by fan subber communities, but now are really in terms of developing the production companies themselves that understand that through this channel they have really bigger potential market that they have with the traditional diffusion through broadcasting and severe policing, for example, of the reproduction of creative content as it is normally carried out, for example, in the American cultural industries where as we know, availability of digital copies is severely restricted. In this case, we have exactly the contrary. We have a situation in which there is an interest for the industry to spread freely the content wherever. One could say, but why? From the point of view of the business model, this makes no sense. You're simply just giving away profit opportunities. Well, that's not the case. The problem is that what would be the profit opportunities of a production that is, as we said, in a language that most people don't understand, that can only be accessed through subtitles? So initially, this is not very palatable. Also because the kind of content is very much referring to Korean society and to a content that for most people is not familiar. So why should be people interested in this? Well, the point is that if you start to giving this away freely, you are creating, first of all, a potential market in which if your content is potentially interesting, people will simply start watching it just to explore because of course humans are curious. And what was the distinctive element that was initially the spark of interest for this public in the Eastern Asian context? It was the fact that we, as a Confucian society, was starting a very, very interesting and creative reflection of the social role in society. So interestingly, this kind of content was initially driven by a public of young females, people who were, for example, interested in romantic comedies that were, in some sense, not perpetuating the traditional stereotypes, for example, especially for Asian societies of submissive women and, let's say, the preponderance of male agency on one side. On the other side, for example, in the musical field, was also launching a new idea, for example, of, let's say, male singers and dancers that were, in some sense, proposing a style that was radically different from the style of the pop and pop West. Whereas in West there is strong insistence on individual pop stars. In the case of Korea, for example, the popular K-pop bands are generally constituted by several elements, and the group identity, the fact that there is a group there, is something that is extremely strong in their communication. That was initially better, for example, to Asian audiences. So you have a model that is local from point of content, and you have at the same time model that is also easily accessible because these contents are freely distributed without being too concerned with copyright. What is the consequence of this? The consequence is, of course, that the model scales up quickly. But that's just one part of the story. There is another part of the story that is important, and this is the following. If you are proposing content, how can you be sure about the fact that people like it and the people really embrace that you are proposing or the values that you are proposing? The best way to do this is, of course, to listen to what people have to say about this. So this is interesting. In the model is a model in which the level of digital alphabetization of the population is enormous. So people are absolutely fluent with digital access, and at the same time, this is not only true of youngsters, but is really spread across the society. As a consequence of this, you have an enormous amount of online feedback on the contents that you provide. And this kind of online feedback will be used to model the evolution of the content strategy that you are proposing. This is particularly evident with the traditional model is a model in which you just shoot a few episodes, and when you are in the episode and hear about the feedback of the public about the episodes, you are literally revising the screenplay for the next episodes before shooting them. So the so-called live shoot system is a system in which you can take into account in real time the feedback of people while you are producing. As a consequence of this, you are literally co-designing the content with the public. As a consequence, we have witnessed, for example, how the Korean content industry has steadily evolved in ways that have been massively influenced by the public, and, for example, emphasizing elements that were absolutely not obvious nor planned for themselves. For example, giving an increasing space to female agency in a society that is severely constrained by one of the most serious gender inequalities in the world. So this kind of surprising innovation has been very, very important to create a thriving creative market where you touch on innovative topics in ways that are particularly challenging, but at the same time aligned with the public in very, very compelling ways.
Luigi, I'm very sorry to interrupt you, but we're having some technical issues to hear you. We wanted to ask you maybe if you can turn off the camera, maybe the sound will improve because we have some disruptions in your voice.
Sorry. I will turn off the camera.
Let's see if it
Is it better now?
I think
Is it better now?
yeah, I think it is. Yeah. Let's see if it works. Sorry
Yeah,
for the interruption.
I don't think that there are problems on my side because I have a high speed connection, but we never know with the digital platforms, unfortunately. Is
Yeah.
it better now?
Yeah, for now
Okay.
it's much better since you turned off the camera. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for interrupting.
No problem. So I was saying basically that what the Korean example shows us is the fact that we have a combination of two factors. On one side, as we said, post-copyright business model. On the other side, this idea of participatory content creation. So in a situation in which you really have the public, what was formerly known as the public, participating with their feedback in the shaping, in the production process itself. So this combination of two elements has been the winning factor in the case of Korea, not only because, of course, it was fundamental for the first level of scaling up at the regional level, but now is becoming even more important when you have a global feedback from this point of view. So working with this model, it's been possible for the Korean content industry to shape up its cultural offer in ways that are increasingly tapping into the opportunities provided by the global content market. It's not incidental that the Korean example is now increasingly being followed by many other countries outside of Europe. There are, of course, many Asian countries that are trying to do the same, and in some cases with some success. But it's also interesting to consider the Chinese example. In the case of the Chinese example, we have, for example, a much bigger country than Korea, which much bigger also, of course, economic resources to power up a creative industry, but as we have seen so far, not so successful as the Korean one. So, for example, the question is, why is Korea so successful compared to China? Why, despite the fact that China has so much more resources, so many more resources, available, has not been possible so far to become such a creative powerhouse as Korea, and not because China has not tried. Of course, China has tried hard to do this. The reason is very simple. As we said, it's very much about distributed creation, participatory content creation. This is only really possible in a democratic society. Societies that want to become cultural powerhouses, but that have serious limitation to free expression, clearly cannot fully profit from this kind of model. This is the reason why you can invest an enormous amount of money, but the problem is that your creative contents are not palatable to people. They are so, in some sense, lifeless. They are too mechanic. They are too artificial, because people today really feels the need to have the possibility to participate in content creation. If you don't give this possibility, in some sense, the quality of the content that you are generating is not good enough. And this, of course, is also the big question mark that is gravitating around the new, very, very ambitious strategies for content creation that are emerging from, for example, the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Qatar. So countries that are really, really very ambitious and that are investing an enormous amount of money on the creation of global culture and content platforms, but which at the same time are today seriously plagued by the fact that they cannot really allow a free possibility of expression and co-creation, and so they are probably not benefiting of the most important driver from this point of view. So as a consequence of this is the scenario. What are the global consequences for the traditional incumbents? So for Western, for Europe, for the West, for Europe and the US. So we see that, for example, the US in many respects are not really standing out today as an innovative content provider. They are building on already existing of course, incumbent power. They have, of course, the most visible content channels. They have, of course, some of the most important stars in the culture and creative content, but also at the same time, they are increasingly repeating the old models. They are not really innovative in terms of formats, and Europe even less. Because the problem of Europe is that Europe was itself not really the innovation leader in the culture and creative industry already in the 20th century. And this is becoming increasingly the case also with the 21st century, because as we see, for example, European culture and creative content has very, very limited diffusion outside of Europe today. Most of our literature, most of our music, or most of our cinema, just to make examples, are not really appealing outside the European space, or even if they are for very, very small segments of very, very, let's say, expert people, but not for the big public. And even more, we have a problem with digital content platforms, where Europe really is not one of the main contenders in this new competitive arena. So how can Europe, in some sense, turn the tide? How can Europe create new possibilities for innovation leadership in the field? Well, First of all, if we are still focusing on the traditional models, and I really think that this is one of the most serious problems, the defense of intellectual property is in this moment probably one of the main obstacles, because we understand that in the short term, intellectual property is able to, of course, defend the interest of creators and secure to them some level of income. But the problem is that, especially in a world in which the most successful contents are contents that are freely circulating, how can you be competitive in defending your intellectual property when there are even more attractive alternatives that are not intellectually polished, in some sense that they are freely available and circulating? This is one aspect. But the second aspect is that it's really the fact that you are tapping into the power of a collective content creation that is only really possible if you give up a model that is built, a business model that is built on intellectual property. It's only in this case that you can really generate fresh and innovative content, as the new markets are teaching us. So from this point of view, Europe is in some sense sticking to a model that is probably obsolete with respect to the new opportunities. And unlike the US, that are sticking to the same model, but they have an enormous, of course, economic, let's say, power and space to build on, that even without innovation is securing, of course, a big share of the pie for the American culture and content industries for the years to come. In the case of Europe, we are in a situation that is much more critical in this regard. We don't have this kind of, let's say, strong basis to reinforce our culture and creative industry. So the problem is that we should probably try to explore and embrace new business models from this point of view. But by the way, you could say, okay, but what is if it is a business model, where is the business here? For example, in the case of Korea, if these people are giving up content, if people are giving up content, how do they make money out of this? How this can be an industry in the first place? Well, from the point of view of Korean industry, first of all, for example, in the case of course, in the case of K-pop, what is becoming extremely successful is not just the sale of musical content, but the enormous return, for example, not only of live acts, but also of the related merchandising and all the correlated, for example, fashion lines, products, all the correlated industries that are related to the huge global visibility of K-pop bands. But also the fact that in this case, you can really create, let's say, an industry in which everything that is Korean is basically immediately branded as cool, for the very simple fact that it comes from that particular context. In the case of the TV series, for example, one of the aspects that makes it so profitable is that if you have a global visibility with hundreds of millions of, especially young watchers, young public, you can, for example, have an enormous market for product placement. So you are, in some sense, competing with the advertising industry. If you place a product strategically in a very successful TV series that reaches a very, very broad global audience, think, for example, of the launch of a new model of a mobile phone, of course, this has an enormous market value. So the sustainability from this point of view does not derive from the sale of the content itself, but the fact that an enormously popular content can be a vehicle of so many things that have business value, that in some sense is the size of the audience that makes the difference. It's not different from the influencing model. In the case of influencers, of course, you have the possibility of a very huge audience that can be reached through a single person that is the influencer. In some sense, the Korean series model moves the influencer model at the market production level in terms of content production. So once you have an extremely popular content, you can vehicle through this content lots of value, but through channels that are typical of the digital market economy, not of traditional economies. So again, it's very important for Europeans to understand that this new logic of content production, especially value creation through content production, is very different from the traditional one, and you really have to adapt your models to this. But if Europe has, in some sense, been lagging behind from this point of view, what are the sectors, what are the scenarios in which Europe can really become, let's say, competitive and innovative in this regard? I don't think that it will be just competing, for example, with these new up and coming industries from let's say the non-Western space. Because let's face it, I mean, Europe is an aging continent and the West is an aging continent. The non-Western voices today are in some sense more appealing because most of the public is non-Western and they don't want to hear any more, let's say, Western stories told to them. So the fact that, for example, new voices arriving from Asia, South America, or Africa is much more palatable from this point of view. And I don't think that we can really be competitive in this regard. But Europe has a new, extremely innovative and very, very promising avenue that has to do with the production of culture and creative content for social impact. What do I mean by this? We are today increasingly, for example, considering new scenarios like the relationship between culture and creative content and physical and mental health. For example, the impact of this content on how people feel. Think of what happened during the pandemic. I mean, listening to music during the pandemic was, for many people, a lifesaver, especially in terms of their mental sanity. Today, the World Health Organization and more generally global organizations are recognizing that culture and the arts are an extremely powerful resource for people to promote and maintain their mental and even physical well-being. Although, I mean, it will be a long story from this point of view. So, Europe, in this regard, has been an innovation leader. We are building an incredible new, for example, field of experimentation on how music or dance can engage with people with, for example, neurodegenerative diseases or people with mental health problems, for example, the problem of mental health of young people after the pandemic as a general issue. So in this case, Europe is really at the forefront of experimentation. That's not an experimentation that has to do with big consumption markets with millions of people at the same time, but it has to do with new value chains in which we intertwine culture and creative production with the welfare system, or for example, of the social system from the point of view, for example, of social cohesion. Today, we are understanding that culture and creative production can be extremely, for example, useful to promote cultural integration and intercultural dialogue, for example, of migrant people. At the same time, we are increasingly understanding what is the role of culture for sustainability. So how important this is, for example, that through a cultural experience, people become more sensitive to the issues of, for example, circular economy or global sustainability. From this point of view, non-Western countries are really looking at Europe as a powerhouse of experimentation. For example, my direct experience with South Korea tells me that, for example, there is today a serious interest in understanding how, for example, K-pop stars could become testimonials of a new culture of sustainability. Where do they find the examples to do this? From projects coming from Europe. So it's interesting that, and this is one big area of future development, culture for social impact, and not simply culture as part of the entertainment system, can be a new field in which Europe can have a tremendous opportunity to become an innovation leader, because there's no other place in the world that is experimenting so systematically on this. But there is also a second point. In the big emerging content markets and also in the US, what counts are the big global cities. For example, in the case of Korea, it's Seoul. It's Seoul versus the rest of Korea. And let's say 80% of the industry is in the capital city. So there is really an identification between culture and creative dynamics and the big metropolitan areas. The example of Europe, once again, is different. Europe has a very, very spatially decentralized model in which even medium-sized cities and even small cities can be extremely dynamic from the cultural point of view. So the other aspects is that Europe can leverage upon the potential of cultural and creative industry, the local development. And again, I mean, the new emerging countries are looking at Europe. For example, they have no idea in many cases how to leverage the potential of small, local, or even rural areas in terms of fostering culture and creative production. It's absolutely not the case, especially in the post-pandemic scenario, that the only attractive places for becoming cultural powerhouses must be big cities. Today, it's increasingly clear that even small cities and marginal territories can become very, very interesting and dynamic engines of culture and creative content production. And in this regard, for example, the experiment of the European capitals of culture has been particularly interesting. I am currently the president of the bid that actually won, for example, the French title for the European Capital of Culture for 2028, the city of Bourges. This is a small city, less than 100,000 inhabitants. And there we are proposing an extremely innovative project, for example, on radical environmental sustainability by designing an event that will have a overall zero carbon footprint, even if it is an event at the European level. This is the kind of experimentation in which Europe can become an innovation leader. And this is exactly where we should probably concentrate most of our strategic efforts for the future. Of course, we have to work on the global content industries. We want to launch, let's say, successful TV series. We want our cinema industries or our pop music industry to have a chance of getting international recognition. But that will be a very, very tough challenge because, as we know and as we see, I mean, the space is already so packed with proposals that the competitive edge is relatively limited. But on these new fields, of course, we have a completely different ballgame. In the case of social impact and in the case of local development, I think that Europe can really be an innovation leader. And by the way, we can, of course, combine this with the creative industry in which we are still actually innovation leaders. And these creative industries in particular are, of course, fashion, are design, are the food industry and the industry of taste. So these are really the fields in which we can make a difference. So overall, and I am wrapping up my argument, Europe has significant opportunities ahead, but these opportunities are probably not where we are looking for them. We have to go outside of the box and not simply mechanically think that we should compete in the traditional ways in the traditional fields. There, I am afraid, the space for Europe is much more limited than we could think. But we have incredible opportunities if we start thinking out of the box and looking at the right direction. By the way, because this is already what Europe is really experimenting with, and it's really, in some sense, also boosting strategically. Just look at what are the content of the cultural calls in the Horizon program to understand that European innovation is very much moving forward in that direction. And clearly, the role of the EIT Culture and Creativity could become an incredible accelerator for this innovation. And I really look forward to the possibility that this is actually the case, because fortunately for us, this new space of opportunity is very clear in the strategic development of the future kick culture and creativity. Thank you so much for your attention, and sorry for the technical problems.
Thank you very, very much, Pierluigi. I think many of us are very excited about all the things that you explained. I have to say that my WhatsApp groups and things were all like, wow, so interesting. So thank you very much for all these insightful remarks about the situation of the cultural and creative industries globally, about the opportunities we're facing, about the hidden opportunities, which I think was one of the key parts of your speech. So thank you very, very much for this keynote speech. It's always a pleasure to have you sharing your knowledge with the CREACT4MED community. And without further ado, because we have a bit of a delay on the schedule, we will go to the next session now, where we will be presenting the main achievements and outputs of the CREACT4MED project so far. So please stay here, and now we will be redirected to the other room. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye bye.